Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion of fruits, and this lecture is about dry fruits. And so just a quick outline here. So there's a lot of words that we're going to learn in this lecture. We'll talk about dehiscent versus indehiscent fruits, and there's several types under each of those. So we've got a lot more choices than what we had for fleshy fruits. And then the last part of the lecture, we'll talk about fruit dispersal. And you can see in this that there's a lot of different kinds of fruits. Some we've already covered, the berry, the palm, and the drupe, right, are the fleshy fruits that we've already talked about. And we'll focus on dry fruits today. So dehiscent fruits are ones that split open to release the seeds. And so they usually have some kind of seam or suture that break, and that allows the fruit to open. And so we'll see some examples of those. Indehiscent fruits do not break open, right? So if we're looking at dry fruits, the first classification we can do is whether they are dehiscent and they split open, or they're indehiscent and they do not break open. So dehiscent fruits we're going to focus on first. They can either have one carpel or many carpel, and that divides them into two groups. So if it's got only one carpel, right, remember that's the female part of the plant, that can either be a follicle or a legume, depending on how that fruit dehisces or splits open. And then we have any fruit that is dry and dehiscent that has more than one carpel is termed a capsule, and there's lots of examples of that. So we'll look first at legume. We know from lab that Albizia julibrissin is an example of a legume fruit. So just a little illustration here, looking at simple dehiscent fruits with one carpel, right? So there's two kinds. The follicle is shown at the top, and this is a simple dry dehiscent fruit. It splits on one suture, right? So you can see this one seam, right? This is a single carpel and the seeds are inside. And this is the carpel itself, right? So, and then on the bottom, right, we see examples of legumes. So this should be pretty familiar to you. It's another simple, dry, dehiscent fruit, but it splits along two sutures instead of one, right? So if you've ever strung string beans with your grandparents on their porch, right, you know that you break it off at the top and then you can open up those legumes to get the peas or the beans out that were inside. Let's look at some examples of these. So this is an example of a follicle fruit, and although it's not a tree, I think it's one that's familiar to you, right? So we already talked about what a follicle is, and this is an example of milkweed, Asclepias. So you can see on the photo on the left that single carpel has split open, and you can see the single seeds, the individual seeds that are inside that come out of that suture. So that's an example of milkweed, which is one you might be familiar with. And then another example of follicle is a magnolia. Now in this case, magnolias have an aggregate of follicles. And so if you look carefully at the picture, remember aggregate means that it comes from a single flower with multiple carpels. And so you can see that flower at the top, and that central structure grows into this aggregate of follicles. Each one of those red seeds comes out of a single follicle. So it's an aggregate of follicles, multiple follicles that are there, and each of them splits open once to allow the seed to come out. So next time you have see a magnolia fruit on the ground, and this is all of the magnolia fruits that we'll look at in lab have a fruit type that is this aggregate of follicles. So, right, remember with aggregate fruits, we're talking about a single flower that has multiple carpels that forms an aggregate fruit. So each of those red seeds is from a single carpel, right? And then an example of legume, you can see the looks like sugar snap peas or maybe just garden peas that we have. Those individual seeds are inside of those legume fruits that opens on two sutures, so 2 points where it breaks open. And we've seen quite a few examples of legume fruits in lab. So on the far left, can you name that species with its scientific name? And then center, one that looks similar, but it's not the same, right? So can you name that species with its scientific name? And then finally on the right, can you name that species with its scientific name? We've had all three of these in lab so far this semester. Okay, so did you get these right? So we have redbud or Cercis canadensis on the left, Robinia pseudoacacia in the center, and Albizia julibrissin, which you already just saw a photo of on the far right. Importantly, there is an important distinction if you haven't had a chance to notice this in lab or in the study lab before. I think all the TAs talked about it though. Robinia pseudoacacia has kind of a rounded fruit base, so these legumes are a bit rounded on the bottom, rather than Cercis canadensis, which tapers into a point on both sides of the fruit. So that's a really important identifying key now that you've learned both of those species. So capsules are compound dry dehiscent fruit, and this has 2 or more carpels in a single fruit. So that's an important difference from the aggregate, right? In which case, right, we talked about follicles just having a single carpel. Well, those magnolias are a compound fruit, or it's an aggregate of follicles, right? So those are all together. But in this case, we're talking about capsules. So it's compound fruit, has 2 or more carpels, and the fruits typically open along sutures, and you can see them here at this photo on the right. And that usually corresponds to the number of carpels. And this is a very common fruit type, one that we often see in trees. And so this photo on the right, I hope that you can identify. We just learned this in lab. If you haven't seen it before in fruit, or maybe you haven't seen it with the red fruit, this bright green stem might give it away. Right, so this is Euonymus americanus, right? Hartsabuston or strawberry bush, and you can see that there are 4 carpels in each of these fruits. And you can see those 4 sutures on the fruit itself, which is breaking open to reveal those seeds. Really cool plant that we learn in lab. Another example of a capsule fruit, in this case, this is a multiple of capsules, is sweet gum. So we talked about this in lab a little bit, but I really wanted you to see the development of the fruit through several photos. So we have our sweet gum, Liquidambar styraciflua here. This photo on the left shows the star-shaped leaves with the palmate venation. And these are the little stalks that have flowers, right? And so in a multiple, you have multiple flowers that have these that aggregate together. So you've got, in this case, it's a multiple of capsules. So this, you can see this developing here on this small center inset photo, right? That we have multiple carpels. And so on the fruit on the right, these are the fruits that you may be familiar with that looks like this cluster of capsules. So you have open ovaries and multiple carpels together, right? The style or the little pointy parts of the sweet gum ball that we love to step on bare feet. And then the ovary is inside, and that's what opens and contains the seeds. And so it's really neat to see fruits at different stages of their development. But in this case, it's a multiple of capsules. So when you're thinking about multiples, this photo on the left shows that each of those is a tiny individual flower. And you can see that a little bit better on this inset photo, right? So multiple flowers that are clustered together that make a fused or compound fruit. In this case, it's a multiple of capsules. More examples of capsules. This is one we may not have gotten to yet in lab, but this is Paulownia tomentosa, and you can see that there are multiple chambers that contain seeds that are on the inside, and that they break open along those sutures. And then here's some other ones. So let's see, with the ones that we've had in lab, I think the only one we've had is on the far right. And that's a real zoomed in close up. So on the left, we have Aeschylus. And I'm going to guess that it is Aeschylus flava. I could be wrong about that, but there's more than one seed in it. And then in the center, we have Oriental bittersweet. And then on the right, do you know what it is? It's Oxydendron arboreum. So this is an example of a member of the heath family that produces a capsule fruit rather than the fleshy berries that are so tasty to eat. Right, so we have Aeschylus sp, Celestris orbiculatus, or Oriental bittersweet, and Oxydendron arboreum. More examples of capsule fruits that we'll get to later this semester. We have Rhododendron maximum, right? These are capsules, and you can see those sutures and how it's split open. These are developing fruits in the center of Leucothoe, Fontanesiana in this case. And those are right? What is the flower or fruit arrangement? We would call that a raceme, right? There's a central axis, and then the little fruits are attached with pedicels. And same thing with Salix nigra, right? So this is really nice close-up of those little capsules. So those will dry out and then they will split open to release the seeds. So today's tree trivia. What tree has an explosively dehiscent capsule? Now this is one we haven't learned in lab yet. So I'm not going to score you on this one, but it's one you might recognize on the right because it is a really distinctive small tree or sometimes large shrub. So it's witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana. And this is what I said is an explosively dehiscent capsule. So that means the capsules explode open. And Henry Thoreau's journal, he talks about witch hazel in 1859, retold in the dispersion of seeds, and launch your seeds quite a way. It's really pretty impressive to see. Here's a time lapse. Right, there's the seed in the center. You can see it's cracking open, popping open really quickly. And there they go. All right, very cool. So witch hazel. So in Thoreau's journal, he talks about gathering the seeds from witch hazel that grow in clusters, and you can see them over in the illustration down in the bottom left, what those capsules look like. And he talks about putting them on his desk. There's another account where he puts them in a pan on the fire and then forgets about them. But here he puts them out, and a couple nights later, right, in the warmth of the cabin, the capsules dry out, and then he can hear them snapping, right, looking at the witch hazel nuts that were on his desk that sprung open and cast their seeds across the chamber. They were thus shooting their shining black seeds about the room for several days. And so it's a kind of a neat description of what happens. And so explosively dehiscent is an evolutionary advantage, right, that results in better and farther dispersal. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. So let's talk about indehiscent fruits, right? So we just talked about fruits that split open, revealing their seeds. And this is a little bit tricky when we're talking about indehiscent fruits. So the seeds, the ovaries don't split open themselves. When we talk about nuts, a lot of times nuts are enclosed in a husk, but that is not considered a dehiscent fruit. The fruit itself is usually one-seeded with a hard wall. So sometimes it's encased in a husk that does split open. So this is something you'll just have to study to remember. And so we can see on the right an example of Juglans nigra, where that husk is on the outside, that green husk, and then inside is the seed, right? So the seed itself is on the inside of that husk. Small examples of nuts are sometimes called nutlets. So we've seen those in Carpinus and some other examples, right? So nuts include our oaks, and we have seen the ones, let's see, on the far left. Do you know what species that is? The other two I'm not sure we've seen yet in lab, but we have Quercus alba, or white oak, on the left with its cobbly looking acorn cap. We have Quercus stellata, or post oak, in the center, and Quercus michoii with really truly enormous acorns on the right. Another quiz here. Oh, I put the names up already. So we have Quercus falcata and Quercus pagoda. We will learn both of those in lab if we haven't yet. And you can see those overlapping triangular scales. These are two acorns that look very similar. They're very difficult to distinguish, so we don't ask you to distinguish those two in lab. And then we have all of the nuts in Archaea. So we have had all of these Archaeas so far. Can you name the one that's on the far left? Can you name the one that is second from the left? Can you name the one that's third from the left? Can you name the one that is fourth from the left? Okay, big reveal. We're ready to see the answers, right? So we have Carya glabra, pignut hickory, and then it's very similar, Carya ovalis, right next to it. Then we have Carya cordiformis or bitternut hickory on the third from the left. And then finally, those football-shaped nuts that have the sutures on top for Carya illinoinensis. We have some other ones that we'll learn. So I think we've already learned Carya tomentosa, right, with very thick nut husks, and then Carya ovata, which we're still looking for on campus. So more examples of nuts, right? We have Castanea dentata, so our American chestnut shown on the far left, Corylus americana, which has, instead of a husk, has kind of a leafy husk to it. And we have already learned Carpinus caroliniana, which we would probably call a nutlet because it's so small, and you can see it nestled into that bract. And then Fagus grandifolia, or beech nuts, in that spiny husk that opens. Again, these are indehiscent fruits. So the fact that it has a husk is a little bit misleading because it looks like it might be the seed itself. But we know that it is an indehiscent fruit because the fruit is the seed itself. It might just have a husk on the outside, but we don't consider that part of the fruit. Also in our indehiscent fruit category, right? So dry fruits that don't split open are Samaras. And we've learned quite a few examples of Samaras in lab. So I think we've learned all three of these. Can you identify the Samara on the left? Can you identify the Samara in the middle? Can you identify the Samara on the right? Scientific name. Okay, and so we have Fraxinus pennsylvanica on the left, Fraxinus americana on the center, Fraxinus caroliniana on the right. So good job. And then we have some more Samaras here. We have not learned all of these, but the one on the far left you might know, and the one that's third from the left you might know. So we have Acer rubrum, Acer saccharinum, Acer floridanum, and Acer negundo. Right, so these are all maple Samaras. And then some other examples of Samaras. So do you know, and these are fruits that you're quizzed on in lab, so this is a really good chance to practice these terms and review them. So what is the fruit that's on the far left? Do you know the fruit that's in the center? Do you know the tree whose fruit is on the right? Okay, so we have Ailanthus altissima with that seed in the center of the wing. We have Ulmus americana with which you separate from ruba because it's got the hairs on the outside. And then I hope that you know Liriodendron tulipifera. Stop and think for a moment. It's not just a Samara, right? What is it? What type of fruit is Liriodendron got? Is it an aggregate or is it a multiple? And so here we know that it's an aggregate of Samaras because it comes from a single flower with multiple carpels. Okay, continuing our journey for indehiscent fruit, we have Achenes. These are small and single-seeded. They do not have wings on them. And everything in the Asteraceae family has Achenes. So you see a sunflower as an example of an Achene. And interestingly, Calycanthus floridus, which we will learn in lab, is another example of an Achene. It's a little tricky too because it has a fleshy husk to it where the seeds are stored. So it's not something that you intuitively might think is an Achene. And then we have Baccharis helimifolia, which is another tree we'll learn in lab, a shrub actually, and that has Achenes because it's an Asteraceae. So Calycanthus floridus and Baccharis helimifolia. And then we have a Caryopsis. So this is a very tiny seed that don't separate from the ovary wall. It's only found in the Poaceae family. We were not going to learn a lot of Poaceae or grass family species in dendrology, but corn or rice are good examples of those. And we have learned Microstegium viminium, Japanese stilt grass. So it has a Caryopsis fruit, which are very, very tiny. So just to wrap up, the different types of indehiscent fruits that we have in trees, right? Remember that indehiscent fruits don't split open at maturity. And we have examples of a nut, which is an ovary with 2 or more carpels, but the fruit is usually one-seeded with a hard wall. Sometimes it's partially or entirely cased in a husk. Small examples of nuts we call nutlets. Samaras are one small and one-seeded, and they have a wing, so the wing grows out from the ovary wall. We have Achenes that are small and one-seeded that do not have wings, and a Caryopsis, which is really tiny and only found in the grass family. So we can have this classification of fruits, right? Looking at simple fruits, which you can divide into dry and fleshy. And then in dry fruits, you can divide into indehiscent, which do not split open at maturity, and dehiscent, which do. And then when you're going back up to the top, compound fruits can either be aggregates or they can be multiples, right? So aggregates come from a single flower, multiples come from multiple flowers. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about fruit dispersal, right? And so we have some different ways that fruits can be dispersed. That in trees, that's common. We have water, gravity, animals, and wind. So we've already talked about pollination dispersal, right? So how flowers are pollinated in different ways. And now we're going to switch gears and talk about fruits and how they get around. So why does it matter evolutionarily how fruits are dispersed? So there are benefits to being dispersed for a greater distance, but there's also costs to it. And this is why we don't have the same fruit for every single type of plant in the world, because there's this balance of benefits versus costs results in different options that are good for different environments. Some trees have more than one dispersal method. And then we sometimes see examples of convergent evolution, where you have unrelated organisms that develop mechanisms that function in the same way. So you could have different fruit types that have similar structures that allow them to disperse the similar way, but they're not exactly the same type of fruit. We'll see some examples of that should illustrate that a little bit better. So first, let's talk about water dispersal. So this is a common dispersal mechanism on trees that grow near water, right? Fruits float downstream, and so they can reach a good habitat. And sometimes you have fruits that float out in the ocean. In this case, a local tree example is bladdernut, Staphylia trifolia. And so you can see these little hollow fruits, right? The seeds are inside, and so they're hollow and they float really nicely on the surface of the water. And that's a real advantage for Staphylia because it's a riverine or riparian species. And so those fruits can float away from the tree and it's disperse their genomic material elsewhere. Other examples of water dispersed fruits are coconuts, sycamores, which always grow near water, as well as mangoes. We have gravity dispersal, right? The whole saying that fruit nut doesn't fall far from the tree. So that dispersal range is small, and often that's an advantage when you have trees that prefer a very specific type of habitat. So trees that develop best near the mother tree, shade tolerant species that won't be able to develop despite growing in the shade of the parent. Good soil is present, right? And then, if you were widely dispersing, you could end up in a habitat that goes nowhere, right? So if my water dispersed fruit floats out to the ocean and that fruit type can't tolerate salt, well, then you've pretty much lost that seed. So you can also have enhanced gravity dispersal. So explosively dehiscent fruits like Hamamelis use gravity, but also use a little bit of explosiveness to get a little bit farther. We have examples of animal dispersal. So we have animals that collect fruits for food. So that could be that it has a tasty or high nutrient value or a lot of calories in the fruit. So we have lots of animals that collect fruit for food. So deer eat fruits, pigs, squirrels, wood ducks, and humans. And so different ways that animals disperse. So you might think to yourself, well, if the animal eats the fruit, then it's gone and not really very useful. But a lot of animals like squirrels will carry them off and not eat. So they'll cache it. So they might bury it, which ends up sort of inadvertently planting it. Or you can have animals that eat and deposit seeds in the droppings, right? So in the example of Calicarpa americana that is in my yard, the one that's volunteered, probably was a bird eating the seeds off my bush and then pooping them out elsewhere. There's actually some evidence that some seeds have a higher germination rate if they go through the digestive tract of an animal or a bird. And let's not forget human dispersal of fruits and invasive species. So we have carried and spread tasty fruits throughout the world. When people migrate or move, they tend to take some of the reliable food plants with them in the form of seeds. And so we've been really instrumental in spreading fruits for good and ill around the world. And then we've also inadvertently spread invasive species, sometimes on purpose and sometimes by accident. And then we have wind dispersal. We talked about wind pollination and how that's really common in trees, but wind dispersal of fruits is also common in tree species. So this is a common dispersal mechanism if you have lots of large or many seeds, and they're often small, and that helps maximize their chances of success. So a lot of these fruits have this idea of convergent evolution, where the fruits have some sort of wing-like structure that helps them move. And so we have a whole fruit type that has wings, right, the Samaras, whereas the ovary wall actually grows out into a wing. So we have examples in Acer and also Fraxinus, that ovary wall grows out into a wing, and so it disperses by wind. But we have other fruit types that have bracts or leaf tissue that functions as a wing. So on the bottom, we have Carpinus caroliniana, right, where those little nutlets are subtended by a bract that helps them disperse. And then on the top photo, we have Tilia americana. So this is basswood, common species in our mountains. And you can see the fruits are on these little peduncles, pedicels, that attach to a peduncle. And then this kind of yellowy leaf here is actually a bract. And so it sort of is an umbrella that helps those fruits disperse and travel. Another common wind dispersed species are pines. Those pine cones open and the seeds are on top of the cones. Sometimes the cone scales will detach and still have the seeds attached, and so that will help them disperse in the wind. So just to wrap up, here's my father at Mount Harmon Plantation contemplating a Samara sculpture, which is cool enough in and of itself. But the really cool part of it is that the Samara is able to turn in the wind. So it is illustrating its aerodynamics. But we talked about different types of fruits. And in this case, dry versus fleshy fruits. Today's focus was on dry fruits, which can either be dehiscent and split open at maturity, or indehiscent, where it does not split open at maturity, and different types of fruits within each of those categories. And then finally, we wrapped up with dispersal mechanisms for fruits, which can include water, gravity, animal dispersing, and wind. So that's all we have for fruit types and dry fruit types for today.